Welcome back to Beyond Well Science. I'm Sheila Hamilton, and I'm so pleased to have with me today Dr. David Healy. He's CEO and principal founder of Data-Based Medicine Americas Limited. David is an internationally respected psychiatrist, psychopharmacologist, scientist, and author. He's a professor of psychiatry at Cardiff University in Wales and a former secretary of the British Association for Psychopharmacology. David has authored more than 200 peer-reviewed articles, 200 other pieces, and 20 books. It is so fascinating to be on the phone with David Healy. Hi, David. How are you?
Sheila, hi. I'm fine. How are you?
I'm so well. Part of the research that I know you've been working on, David, is to try to warn Americans, especially in your latest book, Pharmageddon, about the story of what's happened to American healthcare. Can you begin by telling us just a little bit about how you became so fascinated in this realm of psychiatry?
Yeah, it's probably hard to pin that down. There's been a few different things. First of all, by happy accident, I guess, before the Ssri group of drugs came out first, I had been working on, in terms of the research I do, on what serotonin reuptake does. So what a group of drugs came along that inhibited serotonin reuptake, and they claimed to be drugs that were going to help people who were clinically depressed. I was in a fairly good position to let people know what these drugs did and what we thought was going on in the case of people who were actually depressed. And it became clear to me that the marketing of the drugs didn't bear much relationship to the reality of what we knew. There was all sorts of hype being made about things like serotonin being the happy chemical and things like that just weren't true. And the other thing that became clear was that a lot of the articles that were being produced by the pharmaceutical companies were ghost-written, and that the data from the clinical trials that they did on these drugs just wasn't there. It became clear to me that if you've got a lot of the material that doctors use that shapes their views in terms of which drugs to use across healthcare, if that material is fake news, then it's going to produce a kind of situation that's bad for the patients that go on these pills, whether they're heart pills or nervous pills or gut pills or whatever. It's going to be bad for the doctors also, because they're going to be faced with a bunch of patients who don't quite believe them. And this is going to, it's going to impair the trust between doctors or anyone treating people for nervous problems. It isn't just the doctors that actually prescribe the drugs. It's the clinical psychologists, the therapists, and others who are also faced with patients on these drugs who complain about the effect of the drugs, and they don't feel in a good position to take the doctor on. They don't think it's their job to say, well, actually, I think the patient's probably right, because everybody's faced with a literature out there which says these drugs work wonderfully well and they're free of problems, when that's not the case. So this is ultimately going to be bad for healthcare. It's going to push up the cost of healthcare. It's going to mean that we're all being put on drugs and given treatments that we don't really need. And ultimately our life expectancy is going to fall, which it is falling now at the moment, and the costs of healthcare are going to be out of control, which they are. So I guess that's a brief history.
That's fascinating background, and it occurs to me that even more recently, I've begun to see more mainstream journalism about the idea that the chemical bath or the chemical feel-good that was supposed to happen in our brains because of SSRI is now being pretty widely discounted. To what do you attribute the change in the way that people are beginning to view this kind of psychopharmacology?
Well, I think that's because the companies making new drugs want to get rid of the SSRIs at this point. And the reason that you're hearing why the SSRIs may not be all that good and they may actually have problems is because it suits the pharmaceutical companies. It's not because of anything that people like me are actually saying or have been saying for years and years. It's not because people are getting braver and things like that. It's because it suits the interests of the companies to have this message come out so that they can bring a new group of drugs on the market which will cost a lot more and probably not work any better than the SSRIs.
So I always have people who listen to these interviews and say, I absolutely credit the fact that I'm alive with the fact that my doctor put me on an SSRI. And I'm very interested how you ever begin to counter that belief for patients who did eventually begin to feel better, that they credit this one magical pill with their lives.
Mm-hmm. Well, this is an interesting one because we know that the SSRIs don't work for people who are severely depressed. They just don't work for that kind of problem. The kind of person who's at real risk of ending up dead if they don't get treatment. Well, the SSRIs aren't a group of drugs that help that. So in the case of people who claim that, look, if I hadn't had these drugs, I'd actually be dead now, I think to some extent that's because people go on the drugs and they can be vaguely helpful, and they try and stop them, and they feel really awful. They feel much, much worse than they ever felt before. But in this case, what the drug's treating is the withdrawal problems that the drug has caused, and they can be extremely serious, and they can cause you to lose your life. They can cause you to become suicidal, or they can cause you to become so miserable that you think, look, the only thing for me is to go along and get, to enter an assisted kind of dying program, which is the kind of thing that people are doing now. We're hearing about a condition these days, which we didn't ever hear about before. We're hearing about a condition called treatment-resistant depression. That's a thing that didn't exist before the SSRIs. It's a condition that the SSRIs and drugs like them have created, and it is one that does lead people ultimately to figure, look, life is not worth living with this condition.
Wow. I want to go into the most recent research that you have been talking about, which is the impact on sexual function for people who have been on SSRIs. In May of 2019, the BMJ carried an article on declining sex in Britain, and the article looked at depression as a leading cause of this. Can you talk about that article and the impact that it had?
Yeah. The interesting thing about this was it was the typical article that talked about our interest to make love and our ability to make love, which is the kind of thing that means that we all read it, okay? And it said that actually people in the UK, and this is probably true of the entire Western world, are making love less often than they used to do 5 or maybe actually more years ago. And the authors of the article put it down to people being clinically depressed. Now, they didn't put it down to the antidepressants that people might be on. They put it down to the illness, when in fact, most people who are diagnosed these days as being clinically depressed don't lose the ability or the interest to make love. There's a small group of people who are very severely depressed who do. When you get to the point that you come to a full stop, then you don't eat, you don't have interest to do anything much, and you don't make love. But that's a very small group of people. It's less than 1 in 20 people that get labeled these days as being depressed are actually that depressed. For the most part, the kind of people who get labeled these days as being depressed are people who used to be thought of as being anxious or nervous. And when we're anxious and nervous, often lots of us do things like eat more and make love more and things like that as a way to handle our nervous problems. So the interest for me was, if the authors are thinking that it's because we're depressed and we're making love less often, it has to be the treatment that people are on that's causing it. And unlike the treatment we were on for our nerves during the 1980s, which was the benzodiazepine group of drugs, which don't interfere with your ability to make love, the antidepressants that people get these days, the SSRIs and that kind of drug, do. And it's been known since the 1960s that drugs that inhibit serotonin reuptake can interfere with our ability to make love and ultimately our interest to make love. But what was interesting or intriguing about this is that there was no media interest at all in trying to cover the issue about the impact that the antidepressant group of drugs might be having on our ability to make love, even though, given that these drugs have been given to people who are younger and younger, they're actually been given to people in their teens, and they're probably the drugs most commonly used by teenage girls these days, this is a hugely important issue.
Wow, no kidding. What is the impact of the SSRI on the sexual functions? Is it all through the brain, or is it also actually in the sex organs?
Yeah, now, the hunch I have is this, that it's not actually in the brain at all. Most people, when they think about the SSRI group of drugs, think, well, look, these are drugs that are in the brain, and, our interest to make love and things like that is a thing that we locate in our brains usually. But in fact, most of the serotonin in you and me isn't actually in our brain. Only something like possibly 5% of the serotonin in us is actually in our brain.
Wow, that's
the
fascinating.
The rest of it is in our gut, and our muscles, and our skin. And the intriguing thing about it is, while we now these days have loads of brain scans and things like that, and can see which bits of the brain light up and things like that, in actual fact, we know less about the skin around the penis and vagina and clitoris and things like that than we know about what actually goes on in the brain. We haven't got a clue about these things. And one of the intriguing things about the SSRIs is that if you were to take one for the first time, 30 minutes later you would feel your genitals become numb. Now, this is much too quick for the drugs to get into the brain and do anything major in the brain. But the intriguing thing is that when your genitals actually become numb in these drugs, we don't know. We haven't got a clue how this actually happens. And my hunch is that what's happening, I should add here that I've been really interested in a problem that I first saw 20-odd years ago, which was a problem that's now called PSSD. PSSD stands for post-SSRI sexual dysfunction. And this is a problem people have when they halt the antidepressant that they've been on. Up to the point they halt, they may have had, they may have been genitally numb, they may not have been able to function all that well, they may have begun to lose interest in actually making love. But they'll often think, well, look, once I come off these drugs, everything will actually be fine. Everything will go back to normal. But in fact, for a proportion of people, and we've got hundreds of people now who we've heard this from, they don't go back to normal. That the problem can actually get worse. That you may have been partially numb before, but after you halt the drug, you become profoundly numb, and you can remain that way for 10 or 20 years afterwards.
I would think, especially given how serious some of this, and your report that many of the people who this has happened to have either considered suicide or died by suicide because it's such a horrible existence, that the FDA would be particularly interested in this. What has happened to the FDA in terms of drug label recognition on this issue, David?
Yeah, there isn't a thing that's happened within the FDA on this issue. We contacted, I actually got in touch with the FDA a little over a year ago to let them know that we've got 500 cases of people with this problem, and that, I sort of got in touch with all of the people in the field who've been doing research on this issue. We all wrote to FDA and said, look, this is a thing that needs to be in the label of these drugs. But FDA haven't done anything about it. Now, there's an interesting aspect to this which is crucially important, and it may help explain why things are getting out of control as regards healthcare generally, which is this, that when you get put on a pill, and it could be true of the antidepressant you get put on, or a heart pill, or a gut pill, or whatever, if anything goes wrong on these pills, and your doctor reports it to FDA, or you report it to FDA, FDA remove your name from it. They keep the report, but in terms of patient confidentiality, they say, they remove people's names from these reports. And legally, the interesting thing about that is it turns the report into hearsay. And when FDA are, thinking about the issues, they have all these reports which don't have names on them, and they can't follow people up to actually work out, did the drug, or is there any other way to explain why the person's complaining about this particular problem on this drug? And if they can't follow the person up, they can't conclude that actually, yes, the drug did cause the problem. So they end up with just a sheaf of reports. And in the case of PSSD, they've got hundreds, maybe thousands of reports of this problem, and they've had them for 30-odd years. They had reports about this kind of thing happening within a year or two of Prozac coming on the market first. But because they don't have names linked to these things, they don't do anything about it. FDA have known about the problem for 30-odd years. The numbers of people having the problem has been building up and up and up the whole time. But FDA haven't done a thing actually about it and won't, which is curious. We usually think FDA are there to really get to grips with these things and work out what the issues are that we need to be told about drugs. But that's not really what FDA do. FDA say, well, it's actually up to the company to let you know about this risk if they think it's a real risk.
Dr. Healy, I know that there must be people who are thinking right now, well, what would David do if he had a son or daughter who was deeply, deeply depressed and having suicidal thoughts? If not to try the traditional route of SSRIs, what would you suggest for a person who wanted to avoid these kind of side effects and try to deal with it in a more integrated way?
I think the key thing here is this, that first of all, it's not clear that people who are in their teenage years or anyone much beneath the age of 30 gets profoundly clinically depressed. They can get awfully confused. When I was back in my teens, I know that I was awfully confused. And it's part of what we used to think as being normal for people in their teenage years, that, you're having a difficult time at school or a difficult time when you go to college or things like that. You're a little unsure about where you're actually going to end up, who you're going to end up with, what you're going to work at, will it be interesting, where will you live, and things like that. These are all huge issues that will confuse anyone when they're actually facing them. But the key thing is you don't numb people. You don't give them alcohol, you don't give them opioids, and you don't give them SSRIs to numb them out of this. You say, well, look, it's kind of normal to be confused. This is the worst day of your life so far. You will be even more confused from time to time. So, but this is part and parcel of actually getting to grips with life. Now, every so often, in the midst of all the confusion of the teenage years or the early 20s and things like that, there will occasionally be people who are clinically depressed also. But for the most part, this is the kind of thing, when it happens, it clears spontaneously. I mean, from all the research we've got, we know that when people actually get properly clinically depressed, that these things clear up within 12 to 14 weeks. And the key thing is, I think, if people were to actually come to me and things like that, it will be hard for me to treat one of my own kids. But if people, let's say your children were, or one of your children were actually to come to me, what I'd actually be saying to them is, look, this is the kind of thing that's going to clear up of its own accord. If you can let it clear up of its own accord, you're going to be more resilient in the long term. I'm happy to see you weekly from here on until we get a hint that it is actually going to clear, or it's not going to clear. And if it's not clearing, well, then maybe there are pills that we can turn to, or there's therapies that we can turn to. But let's not do that too quickly. And also, if you're thinking about, is a pill the thing for you, then a crucial thing from my point of view is that I need to let you know that all pills are poisons. Now, the magic of medicine is bringing good out of the use of poison. But if we're going to do that, I need to know that I'm giving you a poison, and you need to know that that's what I'm doing. And we both need to keep a hawk eye on whether the poison that I give you is actually poisoning you. And if it is, we need to make sure that we halt it quickly.
Very interesting. So, David, there are probably some people who are recognizing some of the symptoms that you're talking about in terms of loss of sexual interest and that numbing effect that you're talking about. How do they join this forum or begin to learn more information about what's being done?
Well, that's a really good question. One of the, there's a whole group of forums out there for people who've got PSSD. There's the opposite problem, which is maybe even worse. There's also a problem called post-genital arousal disorder, PGAD, and that's a problem that actually affects maybe women more than men, and it's also linked to being on the SSRI group of drugs, and it's a problem where when you halt the treatment, you find that you become genitally very aroused and painful. Now, for a load of people, that sounds interesting. It's the kind of thing, when you read about it in the media, people sort of seem to think, hey, that really can't be too bad that I'm having an orgasm repeatedly. But in actual fact, it's immensely problematic for the people who actually have the condition, and they do things like get the nerves to the genital area, the clitoris and things like that, blocked. And when that fails to work, people have gone on and had a clitoridectomy, which, that just gives you a sense of how awful this can be. So there's forums out there for that also. I'm linked to a thing called risk.org. That's risk.org. And these problems are ones that we've been really interested in. And if anyone goes on to risk.org, they'll be able to actually find out loads more about the problems. What they'll also find is at this point in time, we don't really know what the answers are. We don't have any good treatments for it. We're in the business of trying to get people around the world interested in the problems so that research can be done to try and work out just what is happening. Is the problem in the brain, or is it in the genital area? Is it in the skin around the genital area? Or where is it? And what can be done to really make a difference?
Wow, such important and fascinating questions, Dr. Healy. Thank you so much for being with us. Is there anything else you want to add before we go?
No, just I hope I haven't put people off too much here, other than to say, look, I'm a person who uses pills to treat problems, but as I hinted earlier, part of the skill in being able to use pills to treat problems is knowing when not to use them. And also, one of the things that I've learned is that in raising problems like this, in talking about the problems, either to people who may be just about to go on the pills, or people who have gone on the pills and get problems, if I'm open about what we do and don't know and things like that, often what happens is that people who actually come to me, patients who actually come to me, become researchers on the issues and often teach me a lot more about what these pills are doing and what we understand and don't understand that I knew about before. So it can be a win-win. The person that comes to me ends up feeling that they're being listened to, but I also learn a lot more about things that I ever knew before, and that's probably the kind of climate that we all need to encourage more.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. Dr. David Healy, thank you again so much. And if you enjoyed this podcast with Dr. Healy, please click on the link on your screen now to become a monthly sustaining member of Beyond Well. Thanks again to the Foundation for Excellence in Mental Health Care for supporting our show. Thank you, David.